the start of the Castrol International Rally for 1980. Some of you will remember that we've done this event before in an effort to bring to you various forms of motorsport right around Australia. But this time we're doing it with a different purpose in mind. With the current fuel crisis right around the world, and more particularly with the federal government's Australian Energy Conservation Program in full swing, there has been a great deal of criticism levelled at motorsport generally in the past 6 or so months on the basis that why should people be out wasting fuel playing games with cars when we have a fuel crisis? Well, I don't quite believe that that's the case, and I'd like to use this program to try to prove to you that motorsport is justifiable, but that perhaps it does need to have some modifications made. This is the recently released Daihatsu Charade, a real economy car. That looks pretty tight.
Very tight. They're turning it almost, I'm told anyway, they're turning it almost every corner.
So in other words, except for the necessary safety equipment like roll bars, seat belts and fire extinguisher, this car is absolutely standard and thus the least costly and the least powerful vehicle in the event. The point of this is to try to prove that you can take a basically inexpensive modern car and use it for pure pleasure without great expense.
Had a good fourth in the Alpine International last year. His best result to date, and no doubt the experience of this Castrol was a great benefit to him.
I forgot that then.
In past years. Car 99, Alan Cameen and Peter Wherrett in a Daihatsu Charade, a car which will be available on the Australian market within a few weeks. 5-speed gearbox, 3-cylinder, 1-litre engine, and away they go.
The little Daihatsu is already proving to be great fun. It's not fast, and in no way could we be considered to be competing with the really well-developed rally cars in this event, but that's not to say that we can't enjoy it. And at this stage at least, it's been 100% reliable. My first philosophical point about motorsport is that it is a very good training ground for young drivers. I suppose, fairly obviously, most of the people who take part in events like this are at least reasonably young, possibly except for me. As a result of which, and because of the conditions that are thrown at them, they learn a great deal about car behaviour and performance and even about tuning and maintenance. And I think that's an excellent idea for people who intend to drive a great deal on public roads, which obviously everybody does. So, motorsport generally is justified on that basis alone, as far as I'm concerned, and although most of the people in this particular rally are experts and have been doing it for a reasonable period of time, they have to learn somewhere. And a small, standard, reasonably economical motor car like this little Daihatsu is the best sort of vehicle to use for learning.
Thank you, Noel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. And all the other thousands of Canberra residents who've enjoyed the rally throughout the past day and a half, thank you for joining us, thank you for supporting us and for staying in order. On behalf of Castrol and Jeff Sykes and all his organisers, thank you. Congratulations to Ford Motor Company on first place, Marsport for second, Ford Motor Company for third, to Ford Escorts. Thank you all.
You have to be fit to do this sort of motorsport, and I'm not because I don't train for it, and for that reason the little Daihatsu Charade has finished the event in much better condition than I have, and that in itself says a great deal. Basically standard, with the exception of the changes we told you about earlier. Nothing broke, it is intact completely. We drove it very hard as this little baby motor car would go. Just goes to prove that you can involve yourself in this sort of sport if you want to, without going to enormous expense. Certainly not going to win, but that's not what it's all about. There are 50-odd cars in this event, and only 10 of them could have won, so the others were there just for the sheer sport of it. And the second point is, of course, that we didn't use very much fuel. 23 miles per gallon, in fact, despite driving it very hard. That's a pretty fair effort, but in fact, it's only the first philosophical point I want to make about motorsport, so let's look at something else. For at least the past 10 years, the most popular form of motor racing in Australia has been touring car racing, and understandably so, because we've been at that particular time inundated with big, powerful V8 touring cars. Very spectacular and very popular. But perhaps the time has come for motor racing to take a close, hard look at itself and see whether or not V8s should continue to race very far into the future, in view of the fact that they're becoming less and less popular as far as family sedans are concerned. Of course, there has to be a period in which we change over from one form to the other. That period perhaps has already started. There's been a change in the regulations for touring cars for 1980, 81 and 82. This is an example of one of those, but it's still a V8. Nevertheless, it is still spectacular and still fast. Let's take a look at it. Modifications that were required to be made to racing saloons for this year have brought them down in performance slightly. It's now necessary for them to use the exhaust emission and pollution control cylinder heads and inlet manifolds. Last year those things were a good deal freer. This particular car's lost about 80 to 90 odd horsepower over the same engine from last year. It's not really noticeable unless you drive a lot more regularly than I do. It still seems to me to have plenty of horsepower, and it certainly isn't noticeable to the spectators because they can't see the horsepower loss. All they can see is a big V8 sedan going very quickly indeed. At these sort of speeds, which I guess in reality are about 7/10 of racing speeds, the car's not difficult to drive. It's quite light, very accurate in the steering, terrific brakes, and all that power we just talked about. One of the really amazing things is that it is possible to take a very ordinary family sedan with some time, some money and some expertise, turn it into a very sophisticated, very fast, and usually very reliable piece of machinery. Despite the benefits of all of those developments, many of which are eventually transferred to our own family cars, the question still needs to be asked, is it justifiable to go on racing V8 sedans in the light of the current fuel supply problems? Motor racing in Australia is controlled by the Confederation of Australian Motorsport, and its chief executive is John Keefe.
Motor racing generally is following the community trend to a downsizing of engines and a downsizing of motor cars. We presently have, as our largest engine in motor racing, the 5.7 litre Ford engine and the 5 litre Holden engine. It's not unreasonable to assume that in the not too distant future, both GM and Ford will phase out engines of that capacity in their mass-produced motor cars, and motor racing will then follow suit. But whenever the large manufacturers are producing motor cars and people are buying motor cars, they're the motor cars that we'd like to see run in production car racing.
Doesn't seem to be consistent, though, with the trend of the populace generally to continue to cater specifically for V8 type motor cars when people are buying 6s and 4s.
Right, that's a valid point, Peter, and I think that over the next, within 3 years anyway, that we can anticipate a change in our capacity class limits in our touring car racing so as to place more emphasis on 3-litre and 4-litre engines than we presently have on, say, the 6-litre engines.
So you do see the potential for change, and you can see that it will be the sort of change that will put people's minds at rest about what motor racing's doing to the environment and to our fuel problems.
Yes, I hope that in the meantime, though, we'll be able to demonstrate to the community that we aren't a large-scale user of motor spirit. For example, a large-engined car in the Hardy Ferrado that goes the full distance, and many cars, of course, don't go the full distance, but a large-engined car there could be expected to use around 60 to 70 gallons of motor spirit, which in the overall scene, considering there are only 60 cars starting that race, isn't a lot of motor spirit. It's not a waste.
That seems a lot for a man for whom 60 or 70 gallons might mean 2 or 3 weeks motoring. Don't we have to change his attitude?
Perhaps. I suppose it depends upon the value that one puts on motorsport in 2 different areas. Firstly is an area for technical evolution and development, and secondly is a valid form of active and passive recreation. Rather
than justifying the amount of fuel used, wouldn't it be better to promote and concentrate on technical development?
I'm sorry, Pete, if I've misled you. No, we are looking into, as I said earlier, the use of alternative fuels. We do have a problem there in that motor racing is very safety conscious, and over the years we've taken a variety of precautions to live with petrol. Petrol being a pretty volatile substance. Our firefighting, our safety precautions on the vehicles and around the circuits are directed towards fighting fires which have originated from petrol. Now, to go to alternative fuels means that we have to explore the possibilities of action and reaction of chemicals on fuel lines, on safety fuel tanks which are made of flexible materials, on fuel pumps, and a number of other problems, which if we can do on our relatively small scale, we're sure that there'll be a valuable technological rub-off for the community as a whole. But it all takes time.
Touring cars like the Holden Commodore are a popular and justifiable form of motor racing. But because they are touring cars, that is big, lumpy and heavy, they require a great deal of compromise on the part of both the driver and the engineer developer. True racing cars are single-seater racing cars, built specifically for that purpose. And over the years, we've concentrated on building them with V8 engines as well. Also stock block engines, that is engines that come from production touring cars. But recently there's been a move to smaller engine cars with engines of around 2 litres capacity, perhaps even less than that. And the most recent development is a new exciting formula called Australian National Formula 2, which uses engines of not more than 1.6 litres in capacity. Cars like this one. The car is based on the very successful British make, the March 793. It's powered by a very highly developed Volkswagen Golf engine. Russell, can we take all this stuff off and have a look?
Sure.
All right. I guess it doesn't really look very much like a conventional car, but in fact it is fairly conventional. It's styled along the lines of the car with which you'd be familiar. At least it was a manual car. The clutch is on the left, there's a brake, and there's a throttle pedal, there's a steering column, a very tiny little steering wheel. This is part of the stress mover, but it's also a front roll bar, just in case the driver should happen to go under a fence somewhere, that lifts the fence over his head, hopefully. Of course, you have to take all those sort of precautions. There's a fully automated fire extinguisher system which operates on impact or because of heat, or by manual operation by the driver, just whichever comes first as it happens. Now, it doesn't handle much like the conventional motor car though, so let's go and have a drive of it. Racing car is a lively, spirited animal, like a yearling thoroughbred. Whereas a touring car has a great deal of compliance and softness in its suspension, the racing car is tightly sprung and thus twitchy and nervous by comparison. All this means the need for a high degree of responsiveness from the driver. He still needs smoothness, but much faster, smaller movements. The potential for development and tuning is greater, and the driver can tune the car's handling and performance to suit his own driving style and talent. The main point about these little cars is the development going on with small, fuel-efficient engines, which can be matched to the body and suspension developments of production car racing. Then, that gives us something to benefit everyone with regard to economy and safety. Motor racing is not dead, it's not even dying, and neither it should be. It has far too much to contribute to our lives as far as motorists are concerned in the near future. But those who control motorsport, not just in Australia but right around the world, need now to take a close look at their sense of responsibilities, to lay down guidelines for the future which will keep the sport clean in the eyes of the people and contribute to all of our motoring welfare. While we are still at a racetrack, and since we've been on the subject of sport, I thought we might take the opportunity to take a look at a couple of cars that are built for sporty motorists. Let me identify them for you. Datsun 280ZX, Alfa Romeo Alfa Sud Sprint 1.5. One reasonably large, one reasonably small, one Japanese, one European, Italian in fact. Let's see what they're like. It used to be considered that sports cars were for young people, but these days that may have changed somewhat as a result of all of the sporty cars that I know of becoming very expensive and therefore pretty much out of the range of most of the young people who might like to own them. This Datsun, for example, is $19,000 in its 5-speed manual form, even more if you elect to buy the automatic, and that means it's somewhat restricted in its appeal on that basis alone. I have difficulty, quite frankly, in defining the Datsun 280ZX as a sporty car in any terms at all. It's more a luxury coupe. It makes a great deal of concessions to luxury motoring rather than sporty motoring, but there are some things about it that are sporty. For example, it's got a fairly powerful 2.8 litre overhead camshaft fuel injected engine, which gives it a good turn of speed, if speed is part of being a sports car image thing, and it is, I suppose. In terms of its steering and road holding, well, for a start, it has power steering, good power steering with feel, but nevertheless, power steering is not something that was ever considered to be sporty, and it probably still isn't. Insofar as road holding and handling are concerned, it's a bit of an enigma. It does hold the road very well. It sticks well, but it doesn't handle spectacularly well because it's a bit too soft in the suspension, another concession to luxury and comfort rather than sports performance. That's not to say that it isn't good to drive. It is, most decidedly. But you couldn't consider it to be a true sporty car in the sense that it is a bit soft and slushy, and you would be aware of that, and it's an annoyance, in fact, when you are accelerating and decelerating, because so soft is the suspension that you get this sort of pitch attitude. The front comes up when you accelerate, and it drops when you decelerate, and it raises again when you accelerate, and I find that annoying. But then when you start pushing it a bit harder into some corners, it performs respectably well for a car of its size and its weight and its style. And for that reason, I suppose, it does have a kind of across-the-board appeal. I suppose your middle-aged gentleman's sports car, if you like. And at $19,000, a good deal less than Ferraris, Maseratis and Lamborghinis and those other things that people think of as being sporty cars. Alfa Romeo haven't made a real sports car since the mid-1930s, and yet everything they make is sporty in one way or another, even their saloons, and they probably always have been. It's an image that Alfa has about their cars generally. This is one of the more sporty Alfas, little 1.5 horizontally opposed engine driving the front wheels. Typical Alfa sound and feel about it. And as well, a typical Alfa seating position, which is to say the least weird, and they very nearly all are. And I can't quite understand why they are, but if you get this seat into such a position that you've got sufficient leg room to be able to effectively operate the pedals, then you're stretching out for the steering wheel because it's so far away. So if you bring the seat forward to the point where you can reach the steering wheel, and your legs are cramped. And it's almost impossible to get, if you are over, say, 5 feet 10 inches tall or so, a reasonable driving position in any Alfa I've ever driven. Now, I comment upon that because, first of all, it adds to a degree of discomfort which has nothing to do with good driving whatsoever, but also because a car in which you feel less than at ease is not truly a sports car either. In most other areas, though, the Alfa could be considered to be definitely sporty. It certainly goes quite quickly for a 1.5 litre car. It is a very responsive little motor car with a super little engine to use, a marvellous gearbox, good steering and top road holding, and really good brakes. Inboard discs at the front, which is interesting because there's not too many cars around with the brakes on the inside of the axle rather than out on the wheels. I have to also comment that, having said all those lovely things about it, that this little car also costs a fair amount of money, $12,000 odd. So once again, it's beyond the reach of a lot of people who would probably love to drive it. I suppose the major philosophical point that's arising from the whole of this program is simply that as a result of the ever-increasing costs of motoring, the capacity for people to go driving for pleasure is being taken from them to a very large extent. For a start, not too many people can afford to spend $12,000 or $19,000 or even more for a sporty style of car. And yet, there is no question in my mind that young people driving in the early stages of their long driving careers would gain terrific benefit from being able to drive something which was truly responsive, truly accurate on the road, truly good to drive, truly complementary to their developing talents. Where does it leave us? It leaves us in having to try to create inexpensive sporty cars from things like the Daihatsu Charade, which is not really a sports car by any stretch of the imagination, and by no means anything as classy in terms of its performance as either the Alfa or the Datsun. But it does work. It's not all over yet, thank heavens. That's enough philosophising for one night. See you next week.